Greetings, students. Mr. Little here. And today on History Bites, we're going to take a look at Chapter 19, Part 3, Religious Developments Within Europe. So, by the end of this History Bite, you should be able to answer these essential questions. How did Christianity continue to evolve in Europe during this time? How did religious orders compare to monastic orders of earlier times? And how did major developments reshape the interactions between Christians, Jews, and Muslims during this time? So we'll start right off with some new intellectual traditions. So maybe you remember we talked about monasteries in chapter 16, but some of these monasteries had libraries, and some of these monasteries became noted centers of scholarship and learning. And a few of these monasteries even grew into what we might now call universities. Two of the more famous ones were in Bologna and Paris, although other universities would eventually crop up. And initially, you could go to university and study one thing. It was called philosophy, which was a fancy way of saying religion. Later on, science, medicine particularly, and law were later added. But for the most part, these universities were run by and controlled by the church, and were not what we might think of universities in today's terms. But they were centers of learning. In particular, they were centers of something we would call scholasticism, which was a sort of practice very popular at the time that involved incorporating new ideas, or maybe I should say rediscovered ideas, because most of these were rediscovered Greek texts, either from the Islamic world or from the Byzantine world, and incorporating those into Christianity. And perhaps the most famous of all the scholastics was a man named Thomas Aquinas, and he is perhaps one of the most famous Christian theologians in like the history of Christianity. But he sought to use Greek logic and rationalism to make the case for God, and he presented 5 arguments in favor of God, which if you're really interested, I would suggest giving them a read sometime if you've got the time. But while the scholars and all the smart people were up in the new universities, on the ground, people continued to evolve how they practiced their own religion. During this time, we begin to see the rise of saints and the cults of saints. Now, in Christianity, a saint is someone who lived an exceptionally good life and later had miracles performed in their name, or in some cases were able to perform miracles by themselves. And saints became very popular items of worship, in part because they were human and they're easy to relate to. And the idea was that the saints can intercede on your behalf with God. Now, of course, you can always ask a God, but God is kind of far away. And so saints can help things that you need. Also to note, saints almost usually were always the saint of something. The saint of sailors, the saint of teachers, the saint of farmers. And so saints usually always had a following with specific groups because they protected specific groups of people, right? But perhaps the most famous saint, the one that has the most clout, was in fact the mother of Jesus of Nazareth, known as Mary, Mother of God. Being the mother of the Lord in the eyes of Christians meant she was associated with mercy, compassion, and love, and she could also intercede on your behalf with God. If you were a really wicked person, potentially Mary could help you out. And, you know, put in a good word with you with God. And so Mary became the most popular saint among the saints during this time. We also begin to see the rise of relics. This has always been a thing in Christianity, but during this time, it became an unusually important thing. Usually because this included a physical connection to saints or Jesus, parts of the body or objects that were touched during life, like for Christians, there are so many splinters of the true cross, like all over the world, places that claim to have a piece of the cross that crucified Jesus of Nazareth. And people take very long pilgrimages to see these relics because they believe that it keeps them connected to God. And of course, local lords, local kings could sponsor a monastery or a relic place in order to prove their devotion, just the way lords can continue to sponsor monasteries. Pilgrimages also became really popular during this time. Sometimes, if you couldn't afford to go all the way to the Holy Land, where Jesus of Nazareth lived, you could just go to your local saint shrine or your local relic shrine. And you can do this to prove your piety, or perhaps to redeem some wrongdoing. Some Christian priests were prescribing pilgrimages as a way to make up for one's sins, and so pilgrimages became very popular during this time, in part because it was no longer super dangerous to go on a pilgrimage. Remember, when Vikings are raiding the coast, it's not exactly the safest time to go take a trip down the coast to see that relic shrine. So we also begin to see the rise of reform movements, such as the Dominicans and the Franciscans, who are still active today. Unlike the monastic orders of earlier times, the Dominicans and Franciscans were going out into the world and preaching to people in these newly growing popular cities. They promised to take vows of poverty and live by example, the life that people should be living. And also they were sent out to protect the church against heresies. Now, during this time of a growing population and a growing cities, lots of new ideas were going around. And sometimes these ideas were like not exactly what the church wanted people to be thinking. And so the Dominicans and the Franciscans were also tasked with protecting the church, so to speak, from heresy. One of the more early heresies that the church had to stamp out was something called the Albigensian Crusade. Now, there were a group of people called Cathars in southern France, and they believed that all matter was good or all matter was evil, and the spirit world was the good world, and we're living in the evil world, which is actually not a terribly unusual idea in human history. But according to the church's teachings, that would also mean that Jesus of Nazareth was also evil, and that's not what the church teaches. And so the church launched a crusade to stamp out this heresy, which was incredibly violent, I might add. But the Dominicans and the Franciscans attempted to convince the Cathars to abandon this idea before the crusade got violent, and helped reconvert some of them back to Christianity once the crusade was over. So there's a lot here, so bear with me. During this time, we see a grand expansion of the Christian world. In many places, Christianity becomes dominant where it had not been dominant before. In particular, something called the Reconquista in Spain and parts of the Mediterranean involves the expansion of Christian power from Muslim rule. The Reconquista is an interesting name for all of this, in part because it implies that it's taking something back, an interesting word versus just like conquest. Now, of course, this involves not just conquest, but also cultural exchange. The translation movement in Toledo resulted in the translation and diffusion of many texts from the ancient Greeks into Europe, from Arabic back into Latin, which is then spread around Europe. We also can't talk about this without talking about the Crusades from around 1000 to 1300. How many were there? If you count, if you narrowly define it, there might have been like 5, and if you broaden the definition, there may have been like 9 of them, only one of which was attempting to capture Jerusalem. But they all established small states in the Middle East. We call them Crusader kingdoms that attempted to build a Christian presence in the Holy Land. Didn't really work. Interestingly enough, there wasn't really any sort of cultural exchange in terms of religion as a result of the Crusades. Very few Christians adopted Islam. Very few Muslims adopted Christianity. People just kind of kept their own religions. But there was a lot of technological transfer, and there was a lot of cultural transfer. So, for example, sugar production now goes from the Middle East into parts of Southern Europe, specifically the island of Cyprus, along with smaller things like the game of chess, which Crusaders were introduced to during the Crusades and became very popular in Europe afterwards. In addition to things like the counting system, those numbers we talked about in chapter 13 were introduced to Europe during this time. So there was a lot of technological exchange, but there wasn't actually a lot of cultural exchange during this time. So it's kind of an interesting episode in the history of times when two ideas or two groups of people interact with one another. So you should be able to answer those 2 essential questions from the first slide. I want to thank you so much for enjoying this bite of history with me, and I'll see you next time.